Hi everybody, I'm William DiPaolo, Chief Scientific Officer here at Tend, and today we wanted to give you guys a introduction to the microbiome. So whether or not you're an expert in the microbiome or you want to learn more about the microbiome or you have specific questions, this lecture will hopefully answer those questions and provide you some information that you can ask us if you need further explanation, or you can go and look up more details if there's something that inspires you in today's presentation. So you might be surprised to know that our bodies are not just made up of human cells, but actually they're made up of a number of ecosystems that are teeming with thousands and thousands of microbes. And these microbes contribute to our health in a number of different ways, and even in some ways that we don't even understand at this point in our research of the microbiome. There are about 100 trillion microbes in our gastrointestinal tract. That's a 1-to-1 ratio with our own human cells, which means that you're just as much microbe as you are human. And if that's not kind of an incredible enough number, think about the number of genes that these bacteria bring to the table. For every single one of our genes, there are 200 or roughly 200 microbial genes, meaning that we're mostly made up of bacterial and other microbe genetic material, not even human genetic material. So the way that these bugs contribute to our health is probably vast, and we're just beginning to scratch the surface with the research that's being done, but hopefully today I'll shed some light on what the microbiome is. So before I get started, I'd like to go over a few definitions, just that way if you aren't familiar with the lingo, hopefully this will help you understand what I'm talking about or things that you may read about the microbiome. So first off, a very common mistake when discussing the microbiome is to sort of use the microbiome as a way just to talk about the bacteria in the gut, but the microbiome is much more than that. It's actually every bug that lives within us and inside of us, all of their genetic material and everything they produce. So it's really the amalgamation of all of these things together that is what we refer to as the microbiome. When we're talking mostly about bacteria, people will refer to that as the microbiota. But we have to remember that the microbiome is not just made up of bacteria, it's actually made up of a number of different organisms, such as fungus. And the study of fungal microbiome is called the mycobiome. There's also a number of different types of viruses that live within our GI systems and our gastrointestinal tract. Some of these viruses will infect our own cells, but they're also bacteria-specific viruses. So viruses that will infect the bacteria that live in our gut. These are called bacteriophages, and they actually contribute to our microbiome as well. There's archaea, which includes these sort of bugs that live in extreme environments, and then protists like amoebas that also make up the human microbiome. So what do these bacteria do? The microbiome is such a new field of study, and we're beginning to learn more and more every day about what the microbes in our gut do. In fact, things that we know today may be found to be untrue tomorrow, but things that we have no idea that the microbiome has some sort of impact on, we may find out. And so I think that's what is the exciting part of this field, is that it's changing so quickly, and we're learning more and more about it due to rapidly evolving technologies that allow us to study these bacteria more intricately, as well as just the enthusiasm as far as the scientific community for the microbiome and how it can be used to maybe promote health or to impact different diseases that we had no idea that the microbiome touched. But I wanted to point out just a few things here in this list. It's nowhere near exhaustive, and there's things that the microbiome does that are not listed here, but these are the ones I thought we would talk about today. So the first is the interaction between the gut microbiome and our immune system. You may not realize that there's most of our immune system, like 90% of our immune system, actually resides and is located within our GI tract. That means in the walls of the intestine, there's huge amounts of immune cells that are in intimate contact with the gut microbiome, separated from these bacteria by a mucus layer and a layer of epithelial cells. So very, very close contact. So the gut microbiome does have an impact on the immune system, and the immune system will definitely have an impact on the microbiome. So it's this sort of yin-yang relationship between the two. The gut microbiome is really important not just for the maintenance of the immune system in the gut, but also for the development of the immune system. So those colonization events that happen early after birth help form the mucosal immune system that we have today. And so some of these bugs are really important for making sure that our immune system functions and develops correctly in the gut. After that, they really help to contribute to keeping the mucus layer that's protective of our epithelium. The bacteria will digest it, so our cells will produce more. That mucus layer is important for preventing infections from pathogenic bacteria, like foodborne pathogens like Salmonella. Our gut microbiome also maintains an acidic pH in our intestine, and that also helps prevent infections because those pathogenic bacteria don't like to live in an acidic environment. And there's a whole lot of other different ways that the gut microbiome contributes to the immune response or the mucosal immunity through the production of one is through the production of short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, which has been known to moderate and to help contribute to dampen inflammation and inflammatory responses in the gut. And so the gut microbiome breaks down food products and other things to produce these short-chain fatty acids that then have an impact on our gut epithelial cells as well as our immune system. Our gut microbiome also supports a healthy weight. So when you eat a big meal and you start to feel really full, that feeling of satiety, of fullness, that comes from, in part, the microbiome, helping your body signal to the brain to stop eating that you've had enough. We are finding out more and more about this gut-brain connection and the involvement of the gut microbiome in the diseases and the functioning of the central nervous system. And so one of these ways is through the synthesis of neurotransmitters. And so we know that we know that most of the serotonin in our body is actually produced in part by the gut bacteria. So specifically lactobacillus, bugs like that will help break down molecules, and from that they promote and they produce serotonin, and that's that feel-good neurotransmitter that you may have less of if you suffer from depression. And so can we modulate or modify our depression or other sort of mental illnesses through diet or through probiotics or fecal transplants is a big line of research that people are investigating currently. Our gut microbiome helps us to maintain our energy levels by absorbing nutrients and providing us with that energy so that we can do the things that we have to do. We know that the microbiome helps produce or promote cardiovascular health by altering and improving cholesterol levels and through modifying other aspects of the cardiovascular system. And we know that the microbiome helps regulate a lot of hormones and vitamin production like estrogens and folic acid and vitamin D. So who's there and what do they do? Well, we talk about bacteria in sort of groupings. And so we group these bacteria by how similar they are. And so you start at a big sort of grouping and you differentiate different types of bacteria based upon maybe their metabolic activities or where they like to live or whether or not they like to live in oxygen or they like to live in an environment without oxygen. And at the highest level, we called this categorization a phylum. And there are about 5 main phylum that we can group our gut bacteria into. These 5 phylum are listed here. We have our Bacteroidetes. These are microbes that break down starches and fibers. And so this could be rice and barley, seaweed, mushrooms. They also are really good at digesting resistant starches. So these are like your whole grains, potatoes, sweet potatoes, rice, corn tortillas. These are all things that the Bacteroidetes will feed upon and will help to maintain their population in the gut. They also are really good at breaking down glycans, and you can find glycans in foods like avocados, apples, and walnuts. And so that's really the role that these Bacteroidetes plays breaking down those starches and fibers. The firmicutes or firmicutes, there's two different ways to sort of enunciate or pronounce that word. The firmicutes are microbes that harvest energy and promote the storage of that energy. So these are bugs like Lactobacillus, Streptococcus, Enterococcus, Clostridia, and Staphylococcus. And so these guys are pulling energy from food and storing it in our bodies so that we can help use it later. And there's some association of a higher amount of firmicutes in some people associated with obesity and weight gain. But there's been some debate about that and how accurate that is. And so we're calling that sort of idea into question right now. It's something that you may have heard of in the literature, or like when you're searching online about this ratio between the Bacteroidetes and the firmicutes, these two main families. But that sort of ratio of having a high firmicutes, meaning obesity, is something that we are reconsidering in the field of the microbiome right now. Proteobacteria. So this is our third phylum. These are microbes that tend to be disease-causing. And so it might be surprising that we would have disease-causing microbes that live within our bodies, but they are a normal part of our gut flora, and they're just there at a very low level, and they're kept in check by these other phylum. So it's just like if you're living in a neighborhood and you have a sort of rowdy neighbor, maybe the other neighbors will keep that household in check by calling the police or knocking on their door and telling them to turn their music down. It keeps them from getting out of control and having big raging parties. That's the same sort of thing that the microbiome is doing with proteobacteria. So they're there at a small number, and they're kept in check. And it's only once the balance might get out of whack somehow through a diet or stress or some other lifestyle factor where you allow these bacteria to get a foothold, and then they expand and they can cause disease. But normally they exist at a low level, and it's very common to find E. coli, Enterobacteria, Klebsiella in your gut microbiome. Actinobacteria is the fourth phylum. These are microbes that tend to help the mucosal barrier. They can be probiotics like Bifidobacterium. So they're there to keep that gut layer strong. And then lastly, the Veromicrobia. There's only one real main Veromicrobia is named Akkermansia muciniphila. This is a microbe that has been associated with metabolism and has been negatively or inversely associated with diabetes and sort of metabolic disorders. So this is a bacteria that also digests mucus and is really right now being looked at as a way to potentially manipulate metabolic disease. So the intestine is a very complex organ, so you might think, well, it's just the GI tract, and we call it the GI tract, and it's like one thing, but that's really not the case at all. The gastrointestinal tract is a very complicated organ that stretches from our mouth to our anus and is responsible for doing a lot of activities that is sort of compartmentalized into segments along its length. So, of course, there's the mouth and chewing of food and swallowing, and then the esophagus that empties into the stomach. In the stomach, you have a very acidic environment that is there to promote the production of enzymes and digestive juices like acid that will break down food so that it can get into the small intestine. And you do have some bacteria that live in the stomach. It's like Helicobacter is one, but there's some bugs that are living in that acidic environment. Once you get into the small intestine has three major parts to it, but for this discussion, we'll just consider it one sort of part of the GI tract together. In the small intestine, you get that food mixing with digestive juices and other chemicals from the pancreas and the liver, and that helps to break it down even further and allows for water and nutrients to be absorbed through the small intestine, the small intestinal walls. And so there's certain bacteria that are more associated with the small intestine, like lactobacilli. You start to see that as you move towards the colon or the large intestine, you start to see a huge amount of bacteria, and that's where most of our microbiome resides, is within our colon. And the colon or large intestine is taking all of the waste products that aren't absorbed in the small intestine and turning it into stools that we can pass and get out of our bodies, but it's also a big place for fermentation to occur. So that's why there's so many gut microbes in there. So really breaking down these resistant starches and these food things that like fiber that our bodies can't break down on their own, that's happening in the colon with these gut bacteria, and that action of the gut bacteria breaking down a lot of these resistant starches and fibers is what helps promote our health and helps promote short-chain fatty acid production and immune modulation and all these good things that the gut microbiome does. So where do we get our microbiome from? Well, our microbiome is imprinted with us during birth. So whether or not you are born through a vaginal birth or you're born through a cesarean section will have a big impact on the initial colonization of your gut microbiome. So as an infant leaves the vaginal canal is rich in a lot of lactobacillus species of bacteria. These are good bacteria that are probiotics that are good for our health, and so the baby will be colonized with those lactobacilli initially. Whereas a cesarean section infant is going to be colonized mostly through bacteria that come in contact with it through the cesarean section process, which is probably more associated with skin microbiome. So you get more streptococcus sort of species in the infants that are born through a cesarean section. As the infant develops, another major factor that contributes to that early microbiome is whether or not the baby is bottle or breastfed. Now we know that there's a lot of advantages to breastfeeding with all the immune factors that can come from the mother and give to the baby to help protect it in those early months of life. But there's also a microbiome component that's important through breastfeeding. So there's a lot of study right now looking at the breast milk microbiome and whether or not there are bacteria that are somehow colonizing the infant from the mother's breast milk or even just through the skin through the active nursing. And we know that the sort of milk that the mom produces is really rich in a lot of factors that help promote the growth of bifidobacterium, which is another really great probiotic. Whereas bottle feeding, you're not going to have these sort of interactions, and you're not going to have that sort of mother's microbiome that could be mixing with the infants, as well as the sort of richness of the source material that is there for the gut microbiome to use as nutrients. The studies looking at how birth route affects immunity and whether or not you have a lactobacillus or a skin, a vaginal microbiome versus more of a cesarean section microbiome. Those studies haven't been done to completion. They're still ongoing. There have been some studies looking at just immune responses between cesarean section and vaginally born infants, and they do find that babies born through a cesarean section tend to have more allergy and asthma later in life, but still the connection to the microbiome with that is not quite strong enough to really mention that, but there is some immune effects that can happen because of the route of birth. Your microbiome will be changed throughout your life. So basically your microbiome is like your fingerprint. It's very unique to you. It's going to experience all the same things that you experience throughout your whole life. So it's going to take in the same air that you breathe. It's going to be exposed to the same toxins, the same water, the same food, the same stressors that you have. And so it's a very personalized and individualized organ that exists within us. And so it changes very dramatically through infancy, through the route of the birth, through breastfeeding or bottle feeding. And then once you get that child onto solid foods, there's a really big shift to the microbiome that looks more like what we're familiar with as adults. So that sort of introduction of solid foods is very important for the child and its developing microbiome. Also, the exposure to antibiotics, which is like a nuclear bomb to your gut bacteria. So the more antibiotic exposure you have as a child for those ear infections and for those colds, the more you're going to have changes or shifts in your microbiome that may be reflected in when you get older. And so, may not be exactly the best thing for setting the stage for a healthy microbiome moving forward into adulthood. Your microbiome is pretty stable then until you hit adolescence, and then there's some hormonal changes that occur that are going to shift the bacteria a little bit. And then after that, your microbiome is pretty well established until adulthood, or throughout adulthood until you start to age. We do know that some factors can impact that composition of the microbiome because your microbiome is resilient, but it still can be changed. And so if you think about all of the different things you do to your body every day, all the different foods that you eat, all the different places you go, how some days you're very stressed, other days you might not be stressed, you travel to different places, the microbiome has to respond along with you to all of these things. And it also even has just a diurnal, sort of a daily flexibility that is built within it. So your microbiome that you wake up with is very different than the microbiome that you go to bed with, but it resets itself and gets back to that same level overnight and the next day. And that's what we talk about as far as resilience go. It's where you have a stable microbiome, you give some perturbation, like just existing, just living your day-to-day routines, or you have an exam one week and so you're binge eating, staying up late, your microbiome is going to respond to that. But that small little insult to the microbiome, that change in diet or change in sleeping habits, isn't going to be permanent. It's going to be something that happens, and then the microbiome will find its way back to that stable state. Now, what you have to worry about is when the microbiome doesn't find its way back to that stable state. And so that can occur, and it occurs when there are continuous or repeated perturbations into your bodies, into the microbiome. So if you are continuously crash dieting, if you move to a foreign country, you're going to be exposed to all different types of bugs, different things in the water, different things in the food. All of those changes that occur that are like really something that are very dramatic is going to have a very much more intense effect on the microbiome, to the point where it's going to reach a tipping point where it can't get back to its stable state of A. And what it does is it will reestablish a new stable state, taking into account all of these new factors that help to change it in the first place. And so we call that shift from what we know to something different a dysbiosis. And a dysbiosis can happen for a number of reasons, and we can actually induce dysbiosis in our bodies through all of the things that we do day to day, like stress, overuse of antibiotics, which I talked about, your hygiene, living with pets influences your microbiome, and your daily nutrition, like how you eat, if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, if you eat mostly fast food, if you eat mostly organic, these are going to have an impact on your microbiome and can eventually change it permanently. And so there's a quest right now for what is a healthy microbiome, and people want to have the healthiest microbiome possible, and they want to know what specific bacteria make up that healthy microbiome. And at this point, we don't know. Like I said, everybody's microbiome is a fingerprint. It's so individual that to come up with a definition of healthy, it would have to encompass so many different types of people's healthy. So what's healthy for me might be not healthy for you, because of our physiologies and our bodies are different. So there's been a struggle in the field trying to identify that healthy microbiome. But what we do know is that a microbiome that's more diverse is more healthy. And so when we talk about diversity, we talk about it in two different ways. We talk about how many different types of bacteria are within our gut. So if you look at this example of this jungle, you see huge amounts of different plants and rocks and water and all these different lush vines and everything. And that tells you that there's a lot of different types of plants and flora and fauna in this. And so just having that variation is really important for a healthy microbiome. And then the second way is the evenness. So how many of each of these types of plants do you have? Is everybody at an equal number, or do you have one type of plant that is much more greater in number that is sort of having an impact on the overall diversity? And that's kind of depicted over here. So when you start to reduce your bacterial diversity, we find that that's a hallmark of many different diseases. And so over here, what you see is that most of this picture is taken up by this one algae that's sort of overtaking this pond. And so while there is still some different types of plants around, trees around, really this algae is much more greater in number than these other species of trees, and so this is what we would say is a reduced diversity. It's something that doesn't look healthy, and eventually that algae will take over and choke everything else out. So can you treat dysbiosis? Well, that's something that people are really desperately trying to figure out, and we know that there are a few different ways that you can sort of work to change your dysbiosis and try to get back to what is more of a healthy microbiome, so sort of keeping that diversity in mind. And we know that that can happen through diet, through probiotics and prebiotics, which are over-the-counter supplements, or you can find these in fermented foods. And then lastly is fecal microbiota transplants, which are currently used only to treat C. difficile patients. So fecal microbiota transplants is when you take stool from a healthy individual and you transplant it into somebody who is sick, with the hopes that that new bacteria will colonize the gut and will help cure whatever ailment has this person feeling lousy. So it's only right now approved for C. difficile infections in certain cases, but there is an active research program out there that's looking at fecal microbiome transplants for a number of different diseases. And so that is going to be it for today. I hope that you learned something new and that you were able to maybe we were able to answer some of your questions. And until next time, thank you.